Hello, I'm Lucian from Shore Ruby, and today let's drink a bit of coffee and talk about why I prefer using getter methods instead of instance variable inside Ruby classes. This is a personal preference. I'm not saying this is how you should do it, but I will try to present my reasoning about it and maybe have a conversation with you about this. So let's start. First, a bit of recap, very short and fast recap about public and private getters. I think making the instance variable outside the object is the main case, so trying to create a public getter that is accessible outside. And it might look like this. You can use @reader to create a public getter outside. Of course, you can also, I don't know if you know this, but just as a funny thing, you can define it as a string and Ruby will convert it to a symbol and create again a public getter. You can also use the attr, the simple attr without any parameter, and Ruby again will create a public getter for in this case, for the URL, for that instance variable. Now, I think using @reader is better instead of attr because the method's name describes what it does. You can define a private @reader. So you define it like this, you put the @reader in a private section. And this is actually the where I think we can have some benefits when using it like this. Of course, you should use it public when you have to expose it public, but there are cases where there are advantages to use a private @reader. And to see these advantages, first, let's recap that the value of an instance variable, when you first try to read it without assigning anything to it, is nil. So you see here, I define a simple class and I define two methods, it is defined and value. And you see when I call it is defined, you see that the method called, the instance variable called this does not exist is false, so it's not defined, but when I try to read it is nil. So what if we write a kind of class and we make a typo or a typing mistakes? And notice here that I wrote payload in the run method instead of payload. So an A is missing there. If I try to run it, it will not throw an exception, but it will return the else clause because the if payload is false, because if nil, that is executed as if nil, and it will return the false. Let's take another example with a bit more logic. So here we have a class invoice builder, and here you see I check for the inclusion of the prefix inside the constant called prefix for euro, and it's a simple logic. And of course, if I run some examples, it will return the correct number or whatever invoice currency. So you see here it returns euro and it returns USD. Now, what if there is a typo? So we can, for example, by mistake, do a typo. And I could write here prefix without the I inside it. And if I try to run it, you'll see that it returns still results, but now it returns the wrong result for the first case. Now, to know that this returns the wrong result for the first case, I have to know the logic inside it, right? And of course, if I'm the one who is writing that class, I know the logic inside it. Now, this is, I think, the case for using a private getter. What happens if I'm trying not to use the instance variable @prefix, but I'm defining a private @reader, so private getter called prefix, and I'm trying to call that? If I'm going to do a mistake, so let's say I'm doing the same mistake, my I on the keyboard is not working, I forgot to press it because I'm typing very fast, let's say. If I'm doing the same mistake, and I'm trying to run the test, you will notice here that it gives me an exception. So it tells me the exact line of code and what is the name of the local variable method that is not found. So it tells me also what is the lookup process. It's trying to find out a local variable or method. So I think if I look at these two cases, for me it's easier to spot the typing mistake in the second case with the private @reader than using the instance variable, the first case. You can, of course, protect against these kind of bugs with tests. So you can still use instance variable and you will write some tests. Here I wrote two tests that are achieving 100% branch coverage or condition coverage on that condition that I have there. So, of course, if I do the same mistake with writing prefix instead of prefix, so omitting the Y, I get a failure. Now, if we look at the two outputs, one returning an exception and one returning a failure, I think it's easier to spot and to debug and to fix, so quicker to fix the name error than to fix the test. Here the test is catching correctly the problem, but then I have to open the test to understand what it does, and then to open the code, and then to notice that there is a typo. And sometimes if I read this too much, too many calls to prefix, it might be that our eyes or our brain will in some cases put there the y even if it's not there. Now, so the advantages when using private getters versus instance variables, it's fail fast because it throws an exception, and Ruby will point to the exact line of code that failed. Now, performance should not be an issue if this is what you are concerned with. So I run a very simple, performance benchmark on my local computer, and it's not noticeable. Of course, if you are writing high performance or performance intensive code, maybe you want to keep an eye on this. But for the most normal or the most common production or application code, this should not matter. What about applying this to Rails? You can apply this to Rails. So I have here a payments controller that I took from a test that I did with the one file Rails app. You can write one file Rails app. This is why I have that include there. Maybe it should not be, but this is how it was in my examples. And I'm writing a very simple ARB file. You can transform this using a private attribute, but this might sound weird to create an instance variable and do that because we have the local. So actually, a more idiomatic way in Rails would be to write it like this. Now, this is not the idiomatic Rails. The Rails, all examples, or I have to say the public examples of Rails are recommended to use instance variable. But this is how you can achieve what I presented for a simple Ruby class in controllers, for example. And so if you do a mistake, you may see here that I did a typing mistake, writing payment with double T at the end, and you try to run it, it will again show to you a nice error telling you what is the problem and where this problem is present to fix it. And probably you are already using getters instead of instance variable in some places. So you're using it to define predicates. You'll see here that I have this instance variable called VAT included, and I want to use the nicer predicate in my code, VAT included with question mark. So I define a private getter for it. Or memoization and lazy initialization. Again, I have, let's say, I want to reuse or to not iterate or not to hit the database every time I'm loading the products. So I will put them in an instance variable called products, but I will actually call this def products, which looks like a getter. So you are already using that. Now, some conclusions regarding this. The typing mistakes that I presented here are easy to spot because the examples are very simple. And I think this is how code should look like. Simple with few lines of code if possible. And if you have code like this, which is very simple, there is probably no need to adopt this technique because you will be able to spot a mistake probably quite easy. But code can often be complex, making mistakes harder to find. Tests are essential, of course, for catching this kind of problems. Functional tests where you check how the code is executing and if it's giving you the proper value. And in this case, it would have catched my check of truthiness against nil value. But watch out for developer confirmation bias when you're doing debugging, because it might be that you are reading multiple times the same source code when you saw that it's returning the test is returning a long value, and you might it might be harder to identify a typo. If you ever, I don't know, wrote an email or a post and you read it multiple times and still publish it with a typo, this is a kind of confirmation bias. And there is also developer confirmation bias when we write tests along when writing our code, either like TDD, first test and then code, or the other way around, writing code and then test. In both cases, most of the time you have to watch out for developer confirmation bias, which is we are writing tests that makes our code pass. And it might be that they're not catching what we want to catch. So I prefer, when possible, to set Ruby to raise exceptions or errors to catch early this type of typos or mistakes. And this approach aligns with what people are calling shift left testing approach, which means we want to catch bugs or errors as early as possible, if it's possible while I type them, or as early as possible when I type them. And using private getters might help with that. So this is what I wanted to present today. I invite you to subscribe to my channel if you want to, this short Ruby channel where I try to post these short videos. Thank you very much. Bye bye.